This is Canon Fodder, episode 36, live from the Metaverse. This week we are discussing Neil Stephenson's Snowcrash. My guest this week is a Twitter poster, a podcaster, and really just kind of a personality. I'm very glad to have him on this week. Mr. Meta Prime, how are you, sir?
Doing very well. Thanks for having me on. Excited to be here.
So I reached out to you a while back, and we tried to do this a couple times, but scheduling things got in the way. I do want to thank you at the top just for being flexible. And
Yeah, no worries.
why Snow Crash? I don't see you. You're a TV headed individual, but I didn't see you as um, a giant nerd. And this book really is like the calling card of like every Silicon Valley tech bro, and I just didn't get that vibe from you. So it was interesting to see that choice from you.
Yeah, it's funny. Growing up, I was a athlete and a nerd. So I lived this very interesting duality of like, I played Magic the Gathering, World of Warcraft. I painted Warhammer 40K models, like, and then I would also, go out. Did a lot of swimming early on, and then, a lot of people know I got into rowing. So I've had, an interesting duality there. But for me, the reason Snow Crash is just kind of one of the books I love to talk most about is because I think there's a few things, but one, it's such an interesting vehicle to have a lot of different conversations. You can have spiritual conversations. You can talk about like alternative hidden history. You can talk about linguistics. You can talk about predictions for the future of society, where we're going. And so and it's also just a very well written book, very interesting, very glib, a lot of good humor. So I love it for a lot of reasons. It's also just very entertaining and very accessible, and obviously the metaverse gets memed all the time. So yeah, I mean, pick your poison. I think Snow Crash is definitely one of the really fun books to discuss.
I tried to read Neuromancer a few years ago, and I just couldn't. It was too much jargon too quickly for me. But when I read Snow Crash, it got me right into the action. But I think the reason that I was able to read it and enjoy it was because it's parody, right? It's primarily a parody of the cyberpunk genre, while still paying homage to it and respecting the rules of that genre. So I guess to form that as a question, is that what appeals to you when you were reading it, as far as the fact that it is funny, it is taking the piss out of an entire genre, and it is kind of just unserious.
Yeah, I mean, I absolutely agree with like the first scene where you got hero protagonist. Also, just fucking fantastic name
Oh,
for
great
it.
name. Yes,
But
and he's half black, half Korean,
mhm.
which would have been really funny in the '90s. And nowadays it's like, oh, he predicted Netflix,
Yeah, and then that first scene where he's like delivering a pizza and it's this like life or death situation. It really does pull you in, and he does a really great job of using that whole series of events as a great way to kind of illustrate the absurdity of the world, the techno bureaucracy of the pizza's burning, and they're making some joke about how, oh, this guy's 3-ring binder, he's gonna probably going through it trying to figure it out. They're also talking about goddamn immigrants don't know how to even use the microwave, and all of this information is being data mined back to the headquarters and all this kind of stuff. Like, just already in that one scene you already get like a lot of tastes of the kind of pseudo dystopian modern day society that we're living in now. But to answer your question on kind of what really drew me to the book, so I think a lot of people who are familiar with my content, I bounce around between a lot of different subjects, but one of the big areas that I really love to dig into is spirituality and expression of ideas. And this book, especially, really kind of scratched that itch for me in a way a lot of other books really hadn't. I think we're probably going to drop a lot of spoilers in this. So,
I mean,
yeah.
if you're My audience is well attuned to the fact that I don't give a shit about spoilers. So spoil away.
Awesome. Yeah. So you have this whole idea of this ancient Babylonian, language, this kind of base communication code that all human brains have access to, right? And he's talking about there's this whole underlying plot with Elbov Reif. He's kind of like a Jeff Bezos character where he like made a bunch of money and now he's investing in all these things. But he's got this like very interesting like
Raft or
yeah.
yacht.
And so like the whole thing is El Bob Rife is using these ancient Babylonian tablets to decode this fundamental machine code language effectively for the human brain as a way to like hack into it and control people. And so there's this really interesting Babylonian myth that gets discussed in kind of this expose format with this like Jarvis like character, this AI personality that Hero is kind of doing the research and investigation with. And yeah, so to me, that whole exploration of language, code, and civilization and ancient myth, right? There's a huge like conspiratard, you know, appeal there, of which I am definitely I enjoy my conspiratainment from time to time. But that's really what piqued my interest because it was creative, it was interesting. I think that there is some like fundamental truth even in the kind of like a fiction. You can kind of reveal greater things about the world. And so, whether intentional or not, a lot of that stuff really spoke to me. And I just kind of like seemed very unique in a way that a lot of other sci-fi books really aren't.
So I guess I'll jump right into maybe a philosophical question. Do you see a person, a human being, as just a biological machine, or are we something greater than that?
Yeah. All right.
This
Heavy
is
hitting
Yeah,
philosophical
no,
question.
because Stevenson argues in the book that, oh, we're just like a meat puppet that can
Mm,
be, hacked via language, that we can be made slaves. And looking at the modern day, he's not wrong in some ways. What is it Orwell, writes about in 1984, that
mm.
you change if you control the language, you control the person. So what are your thoughts
Yeah.
there?
Yeah, I mean that's a really great point. This is actually a discussion I was having earlier today is trying to explain the complexity of thought and communication. Because a lot of times, like one of the easy ways you can think about it, I have a good friend of mine. He's a huge nerd, like way higher level nerd than I am. Like puts me to shame. But he's gotten really into the whole creating sounds using machines, right? Those like big boards where you're like connecting all these wires and you're running the signal through all of these different boards. And he's showing me this at his place one night, and he's like, "Yeah, check this out. Like if I turn this dial, like you can hear the sound get wetter." And I'm like, "Whoa, it's a weird for you to use the term wetter to describe a sound, but that really kind of intuitively makes sense, given the way that the sound was changing." And, you kind of realize that, we have these words that we associate with things. And especially if we're trying to explore like new concepts, right? Like trying to explain the different dimensionality of sound is really difficult, but you can lean into the existing, terminology that we have as long as it's makes sense, right? And so similarly, when anyone's trying to write ideas like in our sphere or something like that, they're trying to put out a new concept or a new structure, a new ideology. They have to create a bunch of new terms. They have to both be kind of intuitive and make sense, but also define something that's a little bit more unique and nuanced. So you have that problem, right? That's one problem. And again, this is the great thing about Snow Crash is it opens you up to having these really interesting conversations. But to kind of get at your fundamental question of, well, all right, well, are we machines or are we something else? I always try to make this distinction early on having conversations with people is that there's definitely like a gradient of people and then there's like an exit velocity of those people. And so you have something like 70% of the population that can't entertain hypotheticals or rotate the apple in their mind, right? You can think of those people as kind of the NPC people, and not in a diminutive way, right? Like those people are still important, you still should be nice to them, all that kind of stuff. But understanding that there's people who basically they can't write their own code, right? They have to adopt code that's been written for them, like how to live a good life, how to do so and so a task, right? They can figure stuff out. There's gradients to that. And then you have your player character people, right? You have your people who, they have a little bit more sense, intuition, curiosity, they're not so willing to just take things on face value. They're able to write their own code. And even those player characters, and you see this all the time in our sphere, right? Like you're still looking for knowledge from the past. You're trying to pull like good ideas from other people. You still kind of get sucked into the common issues of, clickbaity stuff on the internet or whatever it is, right? But I definitely think that we are more than our bodies. This is something that I say all the time online. I think, we have this spiritual soul component. How do you rectify that in kind of a materialistic, the modern day physics kind of mindset of we are just this big meat puppet? I think that there's this extra dimensionality, this quantum realm. We kind of tap into consciousness. It's something outside of ourselves. I won't go too dark, too down that rabbit hole, but I think that the whole bringing it back to Snow Crash, right? You definitely have these people who, El Bob Rife is kind of like hooked up with the antennas, and he's just kind of using the Babylonian code to just, the human machine code to kind of control them. But you definitely have these characters in the story, and I think that's the other thing. Neil Stevenson does a great job of making the characters, all the different characters. Like you have Enzo, the mafioso head, and you have like YT and hero protagonist, and you even have like Raven and all these people. They're very unique. They're very different. They all have different motivations, and so I think this is a very common thing in a story, right? You have to have your main characters, and you just have kind of the environmental people, but even more so in this book, there does seem to be that divide between like the non-player character and the main heroes, especially, and I hopefully we get to dive a little bit more into this whole section of the book later, but the FBI and the bureaucracy of this, this thing that continues on after the US government breaks down. YT's mom works for the bureau, and just the way that that's portrayed with the toilet paper whole thing was really hilarious. And so yeah, I guess to kind of summarize the point, in my mind, you definitely have your NPCs. You can have good ones, you have bad ones. They have good code, bad code. They really just can't write their own code. And then you do have your player characters, and that's just a matter of how in tune, how aware, how much are you cultivating that, genetics, all these kinds of other things. I don't know, whole thing. But I do think, bottom line, we have free will and agency. It's just a matter of using it.
And thank you for that answer. I had several follow-ups as you were kind of going along, but I wanted
Yeah.
to let you roll a little bit. I will say, if I had a criticism of Stevenson in his writing, he takes the Wild West era of the internet of his time for granted a bit. Like he doesn't see. It's weird that
Mm.
he sees the corporatization of nation states, right? Of America, bought up by all these corporations. Everything is run by a corporation, but somehow the metaverse is pure, right? It's somehow that this is the place where real freedom is. This is the place where if you just learn the right skills, you can kind of be a king, right? It's interesting that he doesn't go that next step further, like we see today, right? Where the internet is basically just on guardrails.
Yeah, I think that's a really good point. I hadn't considered that. You definitely don't have like the algorithmic control, consumption of content. I do think he got a lot of things amazingly right with like inflation, and you have these kind of like, these little enclaves of what are they called, the burb claves, and then you have like Mr. Lee's Greater Hong Kong, and all those different little subsidiaries. So he had a lot of these really cool insights, but I think you're right. Like the algorithmic content consumption is definitely lacking. It also could be that because we're kind of following the more kind of outside the beaten path people, that we're getting a little bit of a different perspective, because I think he does do a good job of kind of illustrating the conformity of a lot of these people with the burb claves. And, he says they're, they've got their bimbo boxes, and, all of the, young boys are just like roided up. And, and so he does kind of like stereotype like a lot of the mainstream people. And like Hero is obviously a very unique character. But yeah, I do think you're right that there's definitely some things that he missed, but he was like amazingly ahead of his time on a lot of really interesting
Oh,
parts of it
definitely.
too.
I didn't mean to denigrate or to take
Oh
anything
no.
away from him. It's what's that meme? The science fiction writer creates the "Don't ever invent this machine" uh, as a cautionary tale, and then the tech giant is like, "Oh, we created the "Don't ever create this machine" as inspired by the "Don't ever create this machine" book by so and so writer."
Yeah.
He definitely yeah, it's interesting to see how the Zuckerverse, I guess we can say, is like
Yeah.
a cheap imitation of what Stevenson had in mind, but still, and it's almost more horrific because it's actually a prison that you are signing up to be in. You're literally signing up to be in the Panopticon, rather than sort of not signing up for it in the quote unquote real world.
Yeah, I think like the way that Stevenson kind of talks about like the conformity, right? So one of the things he talks about early on when their heroes first going into the metaverse is how there is this kind of wealth distinction between people who can you create their own avatars or can program them themselves versus the people who just kind of buy the off the shelf Barbie and Ken doll versions of these avatars, and they have limited facial expressions and stuff like that, right? So he does like have this kind of distinction, but you're absolutely right. He thinks of the metaverse as this kind of free sphere. And I think part of the reason for that is, um, and I'm sure you've probably seen some version of this meme kind of floating around on the timeline, but, in the early days of the internet, because there wasn't any centralized like social media platforms or things like that, you had all of these kind of disparate chat groups or forums that the only way you could find is if somebody told you about them, right? It's like somebody at school tells you about. I remember playing Pokemon on Game Boy, and it's like someone had to tell you about whatever the cheat code website was, or the walkthrough website, or they had to send you like the PDF. And so like the early internet was very IQ gated, just by kind of your desire to go find things, your curiosity, you're willing to get the computer, hook it up, search these things, knowing the right people in real life. And so, maybe it was one of those things where he didn't really see a world where you had just like every 70 IQ, third worlder, online just spouting stuff or spamming or memeing or the infinite porn bots or any of that kind of stuff. So, or maybe it was one of those things where, if you created a world that was like too outside of what people expected, it would just be so hard to take in. But yeah, I do think that that is a thing that we've kind of lost is, the IQ gating of the internet. And that is a big thing that kind of seems to be prevalent in Snowcrash is, the vast majority of the people online are, either these hacker groups or there's these people that kind of like log in, but they're relegated to this very clear and distinct second class citizen of, Barbie and Ken doll avatars.
Yeah, no, it's funny. The internet, at least the early internet, was this kind of meritocracy, right? You were able to get around the more that you knew. I remember when my parents first got our computer. We had one of the old gateway towers that,
Yeah.
uh, and my cousin was showing me how to actually use the internet because my parents didn't know anything.
Mm.
My dad still doesn't know how to use a computer, uh, which, probably honestly better off. But my cousin was like, "Oh yeah, no," because he was really into Gundam, and I remember him showing me like what a Gundam was. Because again, I was like a little kid at the time. I was like, "Oh, that's so
Mm.
cool." I tried to find that later by just like searching in the address bar because it wasn't a search bar at first; it was just an address bar, so you could go to
Yep.
Google from there to search things out. But I didn't know that, so I'm just like typing in Gundam. It's like, oh, that's not a website. So like for like the first few months that my parents had a computer, I couldn't use it because I just didn't understand how to parse it. And now, of course, I'm terminally online. So maybe it would have been better if I just never figured it out and
Yeah, and
touched
it's
grass, as they say.
and it's an interesting phenomenon too, right? Because there was this expectation early on that the younger generation would just get increasingly more tech savvy. And what we've actually seen is I think that tech savviness generally peaked with millennials. And you have this like sharp downturn now where the UIs for a lot of these things are just so intuitive. And a lot of those kind of other reasons, basically they've just made it easier. And so there's no reason to like, go into settings and play around with things, or, but people just don't really know how to do kind of the nitty gritty troubleshooting anymore, like the younger generation even. So yeah, it was a very interesting time where like you were kind of gate kept. Like there was this really interesting relationship between the digital world and the real world where like your awareness and your ability to map out the digital world was very much dependent on like your real world connections, who you could talk to, your ability to search things out. And there's just these random little islands of the internet that you could just find yourself on. You just find a lot of these really interesting people and just yeah, have these really interesting conversations. And I think that comes through in Snow Crash too. They're talking a lot about the initial inception of the metaverse and the hacker groups that would build these things. And uh and then Hero's own life is very juxtaposed with, I forget the character's name, but he's like one of the main creators of the metaverse. He owns the Blink Sun.
Day Five Id.
Yeah, I think
Yeah,
you're right.
I
Yeah.
never knew how to say it because, of course, it's a stupid name.
Maybe it's one of those things where it should just be said David, but
Yeah, yeah, yeah. But I mean, he put the five in there.
yeah.
Actually, I was thinking about this the other day because you and I are both on Twitter. Obviously, you're much better at it than I am. It's a good thing that we chose, names that are pronounceable and kind of recognizable. Because when you choose an online avatar, like you can't really change it. Like, yeah, you can change your PFP maybe, and you can kind of rebrand, I guess. But once people sort of know you as X, Y, or Z, you're stuck playing that character unless your account gets nuked. But
Yeah, and this is like a very important point that I think a lot of people don't get, because I had someone, I was having a kind of like a little bit of a disagreement in one of the group chats earlier today with some people who don't really know me too well, and they're like, "Oh, you just put out a lot of the same content." And I think one of the things that sometimes people, it's easy to, especially if you've decided you don't like someone, it's easy to kind of pick them apart and find things like that. But in my mind, when you become an account on Twitter, if you're smart about how you're approaching it, one of the things you realize is you're kind of like a sitcom character. And what I mean by that is when somebody sits down to watch a sitcom, it's not always the case they're going to watch it in order, right? They're going to tune in for an episode, miss a few, come back, that kind of thing, right? If you think of like Family Guy,
mm,
all of those characters are exactly the same no matter what season you tune into or what episode. I mean, some changes, sure, but the idea is that the viewer wants to come in and they don't want to spend mental space thinking about how this person has evolved or changed or anything like that. They just want to know, like, TR Hudson is going to be good quality, literature conversations. Meta Prime, he's going to be weird spiritual kind of self-help, esoteric stuff, right? And so you end up playing a bit, because you know that you can't play too outside of that. So you do get a little audience captured. We're in a niche enough part of the internet that we can kind of play around with that and play around with different topics and stuff like that. But also the idea that like the real conversations are happening like in the GCs, right? Behind the timeline. You've probably heard the saying like the timeline is an audition for the group chats.
yeah.
Yeah. And so, it is interesting because I think like as a, if you become a character on Twitter, right, you have to keep playing that character to some degree. But there is a lot of other stuff going on that's interesting and fun to be involved in, like and also like podcasts, spaces, those are also really great places to have good long form conversations.
It's funny how this the twitter.com it really does flatten you out. You don't have a personality. You have a bit, and you must commit to the bit. And it's I think it's especially with millennials. You know, there's the meme of committing to the bit no matter what. You know, people will even say like, "Oh, I'm on my revenge arc right now," or "I'm in my sad boy era," but with the intention of returning to the mean and returning to no hugging, no growing, as Seinfeld would say. So yeah, no, it's interesting that I don't know how much of it is we've been Flanderized or we're Flanderizing ourselves, you know.
It,
And we keep having the same fights over and over again, and whenever somebody gets doxxed, we get really pissed because they're not who they said they were, who we know them as, you know.
yeah,
Which is terrible because at the same time it's like, yes, that somebody's life is being ruined by some dysgenic leftist freak, and you're mad because he's not who he said he was. Or luckily recently it seems more likely that guys are exactly who they are, which is nice.
yeah. I mean, the digital world, it's different, right? Like you become this avatar. But I mean, that's the other funny thing with Snowcrash is like Hero is he's kind of like this wandering swordsman kind of Ronin vibe. You
Hmm.
know, there's that scene early on in the Black Sun where some Japanese guy challenges him to a sword fight and he like cuts him up and then he gets like a few extra points on his like high score leaderboard where he's like the the best swordsman. And then in real life, he actually is a swordsman and he's doing all this cool
Yeah,
stuff. With like,
yeah. No, he's the so hero protagonist is because I realize that we've gone kind of far afield, and I apologize for that.
it's
Uh,
all good.
but he does not have an avatar. His avatar kind of has him. It's like he built up this cool persona in the metaverse, and then thought one day, well, there's no reason why I can't just be this in this wacky world that I kind of inhabit, and all I have to do is deliver pizzas all day because it's fun. I want the danger of being beholden to the mafia, because of course the mafia runs the pizza joints in America, and America's so deindustrialized and the economy's so terrible that all it knows how to do is deliver pizza really well. I think that's one of the earliest lines, right?
Yeah. Well, and it's also funny because it's just, you think like at the very beginning, you're like, oh, he's just a pizza delivery guy and he's just like really good at delivering pizzas and driving fast. But you quickly start to realize, he's talking about how, oh, if I cut through this, like I know all these burp claves are the same, they have the same layout. I can do this thing. And then at like one point, he like pulls his swords out, he like pulls his swords out after the car crash and he's like running away. And so like you're slowly getting these insights to him as like a vastly more competent character. And so it's this weird duality where you're switching between he's like this badass sword fighter, he's able to get into the Black Sun, placed on in the metaverse, and then he's living in like a like a storage container with like one other guy, and they're like their table is like a pallet on concrete bricks, and they're right next to the airport, and there's always planes flying overhead, and then we were talking earlier about this David character who's this is kind of like foil in the sense that they both were these hackers together working on the metaverse, and David's like this he's kind of like the Mark Zuckerberg kind of vibe of
Mm-hmm.
he's really well known, he's prominent, he owns the Black Sun, all this kind of stuff. And Hero's kind of this reluctant protagonist for the most part. And I think it's good, right? You just can't have your protagonist just be awesome at everything all the time. But the thing that I wanted to say about this is I think there's also this element of people who are who they are authentically in the digital sphere, right? It helps you with that kind of schizophrenia of like trying to be multiple things. Like part of the reason that I came to Twitter was so I could just talk about the things that I find interesting.
Mm. Right, right. What's that quote? It's like, "Give a man a mask, and you'll know exactly what he thinks."
Yeah, but the funny thing for me is, like, that's exactly who I am, you know? Like, I love talking about the spirituality stuff, I was part of the reason people ask me, like, "Or why do you even care about, Anons finding the right path, writing a guide for that kind of stuff?" And it was just like, well, my awakening process was very painful. I made a lot of mistakes and, I just don't want other people to kind of, like, suffer through that, and I think that's the reason a lot of people come to the space is because 'cause they're looking for connection and kind of like assurance that, there are sane people out there. And that's kind of the vibe that I get from Snow Crash as well, is like that the world just seems kind of crazy. You have all of these like drug dealers and gangs, and you've got this like crazy immigration thing on the raft happening. And I think Hero, and this is like a very common thing, you have smart people, and they just want to live they want to live a fun and interesting life, and it's really hard to sometimes be motivated in trying to like try to help the world around you when everything seems like it's just going to shit. So I can relate.
So I want to shift gears a little bit to, and this is a bit more in the weeds of the novel. But since you are about spirituality, since you are trying to find your way in the world, I myself happen to be Christian, right? So I see the world through that lens. Reverend Wayne's Pearly Gates, hit that organization. What's Stevenson saying here? Because again, this is a parody. This book is a parody of a few different things, and it does seem like he's again taking the piss out of organized religion here. They're kind of these useful idiots, right? Reverend Wayne is like the useful idiot for Raft, and I just wanted to gauge your thoughts on that.
Yeah, I mean, this is really tough, right? Because this is one of the things that I've realized a little bit with certain sci-fi writers or whatever. Like, you think that you look at their writing, especially, if it's good, if it's interesting, it's intriguing, you think to yourself, oh, like they have these spiritual concepts, or they're embodying these like spiritual ideas or these spiritual characters really well. And then they have this very like aggressively negative view of religion. And I get that, right? Because I think it's very easy to look at, especially to take like modern Christianity, modern mainstream Christianity, and you look at the degree to which the Christian ethos has been twisted towards this kind of toxic tolerance. Recently I came upon this great account. His name is Woe to Those Who Dwell Upon the Earth. And he does, I think they're called like the Stone Choir is the podcast that he does, but he talks about love and the different levels of love, or different types of love. And then you have like paternal love, and you have like familial love, and all of these kinds of things. And it's one of those things where, modern Christianity, mainstream Christianity has kind of twisted this idea of love into, oh, you have to love everyone. You have to love everyone equally. And you have to love, even the person you've never met, right? Who has no relation to you. And Woe's point is, no, that's antithetical to what is good and divine and natural. Like, you need to love your family, before anyone else. You have to love your community and your people, right? A nation used to be a nation of one blood, right? And so it made sense that those closer to you give deference to. And so I think, similarly, when Stevenson's kind of like talking about these different, the chapels and all this kind of stuff, they're very corrupt, right? They're literally being used as a laundering front for Snowcrash, this drug. And it's like YT delivers one of the packages, and the receptionist is this like young girl, and then the pastor is this guy who's just immediately like gets the package of drugs and like does some right in front of like YT, the courier. And so it's obviously a very negative view of that. I consider myself culturally Christian and spiritually perennialist, which is, I believe all religions are different interpretations of the same thing. Some
Hmm.
are way better than others. I think Woe makes the good point in his podcast that the greatest work that God ever made, the Bible is second, creation is first. And what he's basically getting at is that if you look around in the world around you, just kind of that touch grass meme of like, look at nature, look at kind of the beauty of creation. Like, God lives in that intrinsically. And that's kind of how I found my way to religion. I used to be like Reddit atheist,
Mhm.
very like,
Many such cases.
yeah.
Unfortunately, it's both black pilling and white pilling that so many guys just fall into that, into
Mm,
what is essentially materialist nihilism.
yes.
And but I was able to climb out of it. It seems like you were able to climb out of it, and
Mm,
there are hundreds, if not thousands, if not hopefully millions of young men and women who are climbing out of that and
mm,
realizing. that they've been lied to for
Mm.
most of their formative years.
Oh, absolutely. You know, I think it's one of those things where just because there is a transcendent truth that is beautiful and amazing and will help you find, you know, a fulfilling and meaningful life, it doesn't mean that the people who, you know, tell you they understand that really, you know, really do or even have your best interest at heart or any of those kinds of things. Or they might think that too, but they might sell you something that, you know, is hollow, right? This kind of idea of universal love and stuff like that, right? And so I think, you know, religion's a very difficult thing. You know, it also kind of goes back to that idea we were talking about earlier, where you have that 70% of the population that they're just looking to receive code, right? They can't kind of discern it for themselves, and you know, that's in my mind what a lot of like established staples of culture are meant to be, right? Religion is meant to be, hey, you don't need to figure out from scratch how to live a good and meaningful life. We can just kind of impart that to you. I mean, the problem is, you know, the Christian religion has kind of been warped by the modern ideologies, and you know, I also think you need to kind of adapt things over time, and that's mostly why I consider myself culturally Christian and kind of spiritually perennial. Is I think that we do need some sort of revivification of religion. You know, and sometimes I get some flack from the Christian bros on this, and you know, I mean, no offense to them in the sense that, you know, I think if people find God through Christianity, that's great, and would never try to dissuade them from that path because I think there's a lot of value in that. But I think it's one of those things where governments could be great, but you know, if you have a corrupt government, you probably shouldn't be kind of listening to your government. And so similarly with religion. And so how do you then discern, you know, good quality first principles? I think that that's kind of really where my head's at with religion, is like, how do we look beyond a lot of what's presented and find what's good? And so, you know, to kind of tie this back to Snow Crash, because again, we're using this very liberally as a vehicle to have a lot of really interesting discussions here. But yeah, I don't like, I think it's really tough for people who dive really deeply into that kind of techno realm sometimes to have an appreciation for the spiritual. I think it's very linked into this kind of transhuman concept, right? Of extending life, or you're not your like, you can be whatever you want to be. Your consciousness is this weird thing that, you know, but it's not connected to your body. And so, you know, when you're kind of presented with that, you know, I think that like early 90s sci-fi digital sphere, it seems very kind of Reddit atheism is pretty prevalent. So it's not surprising to me the way he kind of portrays the religious side of things as kind of a brainwashing cult and a front for drug running.
Yeah, no, definitely, and it's amazing to me that of all the, probably like the cyberpunk film. It's funny because we were both in the same WBS White Boy Wednesday space, and they were talking about cyberpunk. But it's funny to me that the cyberpunk film is The Matrix, right? Which takes itself entirely seriously, whereas Snow Crash is does not take itself seriously at all. We don't even really get any resolution to anything except for the immediate plot. You know, it literally ends with the bad guys are dead, and then Hero and his ex girlfriend decide to get back together. That's it. The end. You know,
Mhm.
all these interesting questions and these moral quandaries and philosophical ideas that Stevenson has been building up to the whole time. It's like he's like, you know, I don't have the bandwidth for this. Fuck it, we'll just end it here. Which is perfect. You know,
Mhm.
it would not work as a parody work if he tried to answer something sincerely in the end.
Yeah, no, I think you bring up a good point, and yeah, just a quick shout out to those guys, WBS, and you know, everyone else who was in there. Like, this is part of the reason that I love being on X. Is just, you just have guys who, yeah, like, you know, we have certain reasons that we got online, you know, kind of like trying to escape the mainstream delusion, but you know, we're still gonna have like, you know, fun conversations about like media and art and what that means, and just kind of shoot the shit on a Wednesday. So yeah, it was good to see that. But, you know, to your point, I don't know, you know, it's funny, preparing for the podcast, I did a little bit of YouTube, you know, searching for other
Mhm.
people's reviews, just kind of like
Oh, they're awful. They I did the same thing. I was like, you know what? Let me tell you, there was It was the mile wide, inch deep kind of stuff. Like, haha, isn't it so funny that these guys believe in religion? It's literally Reddit atheism and capitalism bad.
Yeah. Well, and this is the downside. I actually, been
Free speech is a mistake.
yeah, we need to keep the internet again. But yeah, no, I was reading back through some of my old content recently, and this was a big thing for me. And this, it's funny because you get online, you say a bunch of things that you want to say, and then you feel weird rehashing them, but you kind of realize again, you are playing a character, and people come and go, and you got to kind of repeat your message. But that whole idea of signal and noise to me is a really important concept, and being able to hone in on signal, to cut out noise, it's difficult, right? And especially something like Snowcrash, where everyone, to your point, like everyone in Silicon Valley has read this book and talked about it. And, there's a lot to love, but again, there's a lot of people who, they can't get past certain things, right? It's kind of like, I had a conversation a while back on a podcast with a good friend of mine, Lucas, and I guess his mom is really tall. And so every time somebody meets his mom, they go, "Gee, you're tall," and it's like, you kind of want to come to a lot of these conversations, if you're going to talk about something that's pretty common, realizing that, like, and yeah, we kind of like did the meme of like, ah, yeah, the hero protagonist, that like, that's a great, name and all this kind of stuff. But, you just don't harp those things too much, right? You find ways to make it interesting, and you push past things, and, kind of get into those deeper levels. But so the reason we kind of got on this tangent is because you were talking about the ending, and one of the YouTube videos that I listened to, the guy was talking about how he didn't like the ending because it didn't wrap it up. And then he goes on to say, well, but the ending's good because, maybe there's something to that. And I think that was a big thing for me is, and to exactly to your point, you can't solve all of the problems of this like crazy world that they find themselves into. And I think that that's a very strong analogy for a lot of people who are kind of breaking from the mainstream delusion, right? There's no going back, like once you realize how crazy and weird the world is, there's no going back. Like you are stuck in this post awakening reality. And so you just kind of have to deal with it. You have to do the best that you can, which is solve the immediate problem and get the girl, you know? And so I think that they do that pretty well. And, it kind of gives you this opportunity to kind of, speculate, where does this stuff go? I think it makes it a lot more interesting. But yeah, if he had solved it all and wrapped it up into a neat little bow, and then they saved the world, yeah, I think that would have been even worse than anything else he could have
And
done.
also, I think he probably would have gotten a lot wrong. You know,
Mm,
it's easier to be prescient of issues rather than solutions. It's like the leftists are terrific at critiquing society. Their solutions are god awful, but they really understand what the problem is. If I'm going to give them any sort of due, right? That'll be it. Uh, you mentioned the FBI in earlier, right? And I wanted to circle back to that because I you're right. The way that the government is structured in the book is really funny, and we see it sort of borne out today, where it really is. Yes, America is a bunch of enclaves, but it all kind of works together in this. Curtis Yarvin would kind of call it the cathedral. You know what I mean? And Stevenson sees that, or at least he's seeing that that's where it's going, right?
Well, and that whole scene. So for those of you who haven't read it, or maybe you've read it and it's been a while, like the scene that we're kind of talking about here is YT's mom works for the FBI, or the bureau, or whatever they call it, and it's kind of this remnant left over from the collapse of the American government, right? It had enough power that it could just kind of exist on its own. And so I think like they just have like this little area of their own territory where the FBI buildings used to be. And her her mom like walks on, and she's talking about how, "Oh, you can't arrive too late, you can't arrive too early, right? You get an email, and it like will watch your eyes reading it, and it will, did you read too slowly? Did you not read did you read too fast and kind of skip things? So you have to know exactly the right amount of time to like pretend like, and so it's this hugely performative thing, right? And then they're also talking about the email is about toilet paper, and obviously they live in this like post hyperinflation world where if you're going to use US currency, which they're forcing everyone to use in the FBI building, like you have to literally bring in like a wheelbarrow of money to like donate enough to be equal to like a couple rolls of toilet paper. And so they're just saying, hey, everyone just bring in toilet paper instead of money. And it's this whole ridiculous thing. And it's such like it's a very short part of the book, but it's such a beautiful little illustration of just how ridiculously over bureaucratized things could be in this world. And and
I mean,
that
even
is
the mafia is bureaucratized.
mm,
They're so corporate, or they've become their business is so quote unquote legitimate, right? To borrow their own phraseology, that they have this hulking infrastructure that they're kind of bogged down by, and it's only by the will of the man at the top, Uncle Enzo, that really anything in the plot gets done at all. It's only because he takes an interest in YT, and it's only because he decides that he wants to help her in the end and rescue her that really anything in the plot happens at all, at least out in the real world.
yeah. I mean, YT is definitely an interesting character because part of it too is like you understand her to be like a young girl. And then I was watching one of the reviews recently, and so someone was like, "She's 15," and you're like, "Oh shit!" Like I didn't realize that, because that makes it a little awkward in the sense that, there is like
Yes,
some
officer, right there, the man with the TV head.
yeah, you're like, oh, that there is like a hanky panky scene, yeah, later on. So it's a little bit of a quandary, but also at the same time, it's like, all right, well, yeah, she's like a very spunky character. Like she's like the teenage girl, right? She's got kind of the rebellious streak. She has this boyfriend. This is another really funny like commentary. Like the boyfriend's kind of like doesn't get her at all, and she's like kind of frustrated by that, but she also just doesn't care really. And and so like, and then yeah, she has her own kind of like devil may care attitude to a lot of this stuff. And I think you
She
see this.
she's like the proto manic pixie dream girl in ways.
Mhm. Yeah, yeah, definitely. And then
People want to say Ramona Flowers ruined an entire generation of women, but YT definitely has to share some of the blame there.
yeah, well, I think this is because, if you're the kind of guy who enjoys Snow Crash, like you want that kind of like cyberpunk kind of like bad girl kind of vibe, you
And you're
know?
going to be a libertarian. Sorry, I
um
couldn't resist. It's
yeah.
it's a phebophilia.
Yeah. Well, and it's one of those things where what's the Sam Hyde joke where it's like you don't want a girlfriend, you want an autistic boyfriend or something like that. So, it's like yeah, I mean, I don't know. The whole gender discourse is really interesting, and I don't want to get sidetracked too much, but it definitely feels like a lot of that was a psyop where, you kind of there's a lot of this writing pretending that like girls could be this character, but it's definitely not really the case. And yeah, it's a little too much of a melding of like guys want.
Let's write a guy with tits kind
Yeah,
of thing. Yeah.
exactly. Yeah, like a cool guy with tits. And I think that's what a lot of guys mistakenly want too out of their partners is
Hmm.
they want like a guy best friend who's also a girl, and comes with all those benefits as well. And yeah, so I think that's kind of like how YT is written. But it's I think like they do a good job in the sense that like Hero is pretty obviously like you're a kid. I'm not gonna like mess with you, and all that kind of stuff. So very interesting character. And I think like Enzo also, Uncle Enzo, like kind of takes a liking to her, and he gives her his dog tags and stuff like that. And it's like very clearly like a grandfatherly paternal
Right, right. It's
protection.
there's no creepiness there, which it could have gotten bad. And luckily Stevenson has he's not Stephen King.
Yeah. One of my favorite scenes that's not often talked about is the whole scene where YT gets into the super mega diesel truck
Mm,
that, the guy who I guess he was like a veteran who got maimed in some war. And so it's like he's like, yeah, if I needed to have a wheelchair, so I might as well have this like walking tank that he has.
right, right. Yeah, no, especially the way that you hear shit libs talk about truck culture,
Mm.
right? And the way that guys, I live in a place where there are a lot of pickup trucks and they're just huge. And my only problem with them is like if there's an inexperienced woman driving it, and I'm like, all right, you need to figure out what you're doing, right? Because I had a pickup truck at one point. I had a pickup truck in high school, and I love that thing. But it was a lot smaller than the way they make it now. I don't know if you know the story behind that, but the EPA really fucked up, and now we are getting these giant diesel tanks that can't fit in a regular parking spot. But anyway, sorry, I digress a lot. I don't really have much commentary there unless you do.
Yeah, well, I just thought that scene was really interesting, right? Because also at the same time, this guy, he's like in the metaverse. He's like spent all of this like money and processing power of having this like little kind of like Japanese vibe with these like attendants who are like massaging him and like
Mm,
feeding him tea and stuff like that. Again, it kind of like talks to that kind of transhuman escape into the digital. I do so I'm reoccurring guest on the Mario Nafal AI spaces, and like I almost forgot how I got into it. Basically, I think it was like Trash Discourse or some other account on Twitter. We were like mutuals after doing some sort of space together or something like that. And he was doing the Mario Nafal things, and they were talking about AI this one time, and it's like, oh, I really want to like chime in, but obviously it's like a multi-thousand person space, and so I'm like, there's no way I'm going to get in. But I saw Trash is up, and he was able to put in the good word, and then ever since that, they've been keep inviting me back. And I think part of the reason is it's not always easy to have people who are so terminally online and willing to talk about AI as I am. But one of the conversations that you kind of keep having in the AI sphere, and similarly with the kind of the snow crash is a great vehicle to have this discussion. I think AI is a great vehicle to have the like, what should we be doing with our lives kind of discussion? Because it's very easy to get into this idea of, and there's definitely a point in my life where I thought like, oh, just put me in the like the Matrix, little, tube thing, and like jack me in, and I'll just basically play out like, World of Warcraft, adventure sim, futuristic sim, and just for the rest of my life. But you kind of realize, well, that's not really fulfilling, right? That's kind of fake. You should have an effect on the real world. And but the question becomes, okay, well, to what degree can you save the real world? Like, you have this kind of pull of going into the digital and being whatever you want to be versus, being in the real world and being kind of limited to whatever you can do there. But at the same time, this guy is kind of living the best of both worlds where he's like, sure, he's this, he does have this kind of like inflated digital persona and presence, but he is driving around a giant truck with like, machine guns and rockets and drones and stuff
yeah,
like
no, he's like turbo American.
yeah, and that whole scene too is really pretty cool where they're trying to get the sample and everything like that. So, I don't know, I think that whole basically the idea of where should you put your energy, put your focus, and I think you have the love interest, Hero's love interest, Juanita, she's basically the reason that he gets into this whole thing, right? And she brings him back into the real, and I think that that's kind of the case for a lot of people is, we live in this kind of terminally online world, but like all of the girls online are that there's that old internet joke of like there are no girls online. So yeah, it's I think like if people, there's a lot of good reasons to be grounded in the real world, but maybe some people need the presence of a good woman or something like that. Who knows?
Right. It's like women, instead of touch grass, it's touch women. Consensually, of course.
Yes.
Uh, Now, I did want to. We're coming close to time,
Sure.
and I feel bad because we went all over the place. We sprayed the target rather than getting precise. I did want to ask your thoughts on the use of Sumerian, right? And
Mm,
the fact that it's one of the first recorded languages. The Tower of Babel myth plays a big, well, myth, but the Tower of Babel plays a big a part in the plot of the story. And I was wondering, what are your thoughts on like the language, like the first language of Western civilization, and rat, how it kind of plays in as really like the human coding language. It's interesting what Stevenson's doing there, and I wanted to know what your thoughts on that.
yeah, well, I kind of mentioned at the beginning that part of the biggest draw for this story was just how interesting that whole bit of, oh, ancient human code language, and you can kind of use it to tap into things, and what does that mean? And I think in the story, it's been a while since I've read the book, and they're talking about how in the past they'd go to the temple and they had kind of was it the May, right? The code
Hmm.
for how to do something. And that, Enki comes around and it's like through the Nan Shub of Enki is able to like free people from being stuck in this like coded existence. And he kind of gives them free will. And it's interesting to me, right? Because as someone who's a perennialist and I have an appreciation for kind of Jungian archetypes. And you talk about like, the meta myth, the hero's journey, right? I think a lot of these are kind of transcendent meta patterns, right? Of just, stories or just the way that the world works and how things work. And so that whole background kind of delve into, I think I've been saying Babylonian this entire time, so I appreciate you like gently correcting me. But yeah, the Sumerian, myths, to me, there is like, even if Stevenson's coming up with these things from scratch, right? It's kind of like you can't write something that's outside of these kind of transcendent patterns without risking it not feeling right to the reader. And so when you have good writers, they just kind of intrinsically, whether they understand it or not, tap into these transcendent patterns and kind of share them in that way. And so that was a part of it. Is like, for me, it's kind of like if you read like a fortune cookie, and it's a fortune cookie, right? But it, for some reason, the little blurb like speaks to you, right? It like just seems to like encourage you about that one thing that you're having trouble with, right? To me, there's an element of that in good literature where, when you read stuff like that, where they've kind of tapped into those transcendent patterns, it can just kind of, and it's different for every reader, but it speaks to you in that way. And so that idea of breaking free from the code, from finding your own path, having freedom, that was a big thing. The universality of language, there is something to that. The human experience is universal and transcendent, but we're always trying to, and by necessity, we have to communicate it through language, right? I have a thread. It was one of the first threads that I wrote. It's called Understanding Intelligence Using the Analogy of Music. It's in my like highlighted tabs. And
I'll have to
it,
read that one. Because that sounds really interesting.
yeah, I mean, I'll give you the quick summary, which is, if you imagine, if you have like a symphony inside of your head, right? With all the, Beethoven used to be able to conceptualize entire symphonies, and it's not just the notes, but it's the different sounds of the instruments, the intonation, the movement of the music. It's very, very complex stuff. But if you're sitting across from Beethoven, you ask him to explain to you what's going on in his head, right? Well, he can't open his mouth and send out an entire symphony, right? He's basically limited to humming the melody line, or
Right.
that's kind of what language is, right? What words are, right? Is we say things like dog or cat, right? Or book or whatever it is. They're very low fidelity ways of explaining things, but that's beneficial because you kind of need low fidelity language to have like an ease of communication, right? Because if you were speaking in extremely specific terms all the time, that's kind of like the joke J.R.R. Tolkien makes with the Entish speak. It would take forever. but, there is that kind of loss of complexity, loss of fidelity. So I mean, that's a huge part of what I enjoyed so much about Snow Crash is it's very rare to me that people like playing around with that idea of language, or like the inception of, if you can think of like speaking to someone as speaking out a spell, right?
Mm.
You're like you're evoking an idea in their head just by vibrating, your vocal cords, right? I was walking around with some friends earlier today, and somebody made some pretty crude joke, and the other guy's like, "Oh, dude, I don't even want to hear that. I don't want you, like, you shouldn't say that. You shouldn't joke about that. It's just so gnarly. Like, no one should have to hear that." And it's funny to think of like words as having that level of an effect that you can kind of elicit something in somebody's mind. I think I guess the last thing I'll point out here, summarize by saying, like, I think we often become used to the magical nature of our world, and I think that that's kind of a sad thing, right? I mean, it's
Mm.
part of have kids is to reignite that appreciation for how magical the world is around us. And I think, to me, Stevenson kind of talking about that idea of how intricate and interesting and amazing and kind of magical language is, it was a very unique angle to embed into a sci-fi book that, again, way ahead of its time in predicting things like the metaverse and all this kind of stuff, but also weirdly reaches back into ancient Sumerian and talks about all
Yeah,
the
no, yeah, yeah, yeah. I wanted to bring that up because yes, we're talking about like the first one of the first written languages and spoken languages, certainly one of the earliest ones that we've found in archaeology, compared to the future speak, right? The kind of advanced digital slang that everybody talks with in the quote unquote modern day, in the future of Snow Crash. Anybody driving like a minivan is driving a bimbo box, or oh, I forget what he calls himself, the deliverator, or the couriers, spelt with a K. It's very much like they have their own mimetic language that really precedes like internet memes by like 20 years. I think that's probably one of the more impressive feats that Stevenson has, is that he builds off of the English language in a very believable way.
one of the videos that I was watching, and they were talking about how they didn't really like the exposition dump of having this Jarvis-like character and this going back through the history and like searching through the notes of the other investigative gargoyle or whatever it was.
Mhm.
And to me, I love that. I found that so exciting, like really interesting stuff like that. I don't know. I really like that kind of film noir, hard boiled detective style, like putting the pieces together. I don't know. I thought they did a great job. And I also thought that it was, again, maybe we don't have an appreciation, as much appreciation for it now, of how that, like the AI interaction, and, he talks about how it's limited. It can't make inferences and stuff like that. It can only like kind of bring up data that's being stored. So I thought that was very imaginative. It was very interesting. I also not only read the book, but also listened to the audiobook, and the audiobook is great too. Like, he does really good with all the voices. And, if you're on a long car trip, it does feel like you're kind of having this like inquisitive conversation with the AI Jarvis character. So, yeah, I mean, I personally really enjoyed that whole part of the book. Yeah, I think it was very unique in that way, just kind of like, jam in a bunch of this historical stuff. But that's kind of how I see the modern world. We're just as kind of primitive as we've always been as humans. We're now just playing with godlike technology,
Mhm.
and this kind of contrast between being just very flesh and blood biological beings playing with these, yeah, godlike tools. It's a very weird duality to kind of exist in, and it's no wonder that we're a little lost in doing it. But yeah, I think he does it like a great job of melding that, because I think you need to have that grounding in the past, right? Like, that's to some degree what he's talking about, is even in the far flung future, no, we're not going to be able to escape our biology. We're not going to be able to escape like our history and kind of these weird transcendent spiritual concepts. Even if he's doesn't really intentionally do it, like that's kind of how I see this is, it's just this drawback to this foundational human past that's inescapable even in the digital world.
Well, it's funny that you say that because that idea was the inspiration for my first book, and I don't mean to talk too much about my own stuff, only that the idea that I was obsessed with for a long time, especially I wrote most of it during COVID, was like, are we as a society, as people, have we sort of gotten too used to the technological crutch that we have, and like the supply chain that we have, and like the comforts of modernity, and if that were to go away, like would we be able to survive that? That's where my first book came from.
Yeah. Well, I mean, and this is a big thing that I'm doing now, right? And this is a little far aside from discussing literature, but maybe an important topic to kind of touch on. I very much believe that we're going to see a Trump presidency, and that's going to be ushered in largely by the tech elite. You basically have like Elon, Andreessen, Thiel. These guys want to do the tech elite equivalent of just grill bro, which is, send rockets to Mars and build cool toys. And they just can't do that because the government's too corrupt. But they're also too incompetent, right? So you have all these issues with like Elon got screwed in Delaware out of like a giant bonus. And then he's also having to battle with this like weird DEI rules around, he's got to hire so many people because it's a government contract, but it's a space contract with, high clearance. So he
Right.
can't,
So
he can't.
he can't hire a
Yeah.
bunch of non-cleared immigrants, and yeah, it's he's got to be, because I'm sure he's read this book, but he's got to be thinking like, damn, if only we could just break this up and I could live in my bird cave and launch my rockets and have a bajillion children.
Oh, he's getting there. I think what he like just had number 13 or something.
Well, and then like Peter Thiel, he because you mentioned him, he
Mm,
for the longest time was like, oh yeah, no, we should just build these artificial islands so that we could like live in our techno libertarian utopia. And my treasured mutual, Mark Andreessen,
mhm.
his ideas are, you're definitely right. He is trending towards like the apparatus that is currently running things is a hindrance to my goals, which is really interesting when you have like guys with actual. It's not just online spurgs like myself who are seeing the problems, but people of consequence.
Yeah. I think that's a big white pill for me. I don't think they're like completely our guys and they'll do everything that we want them to do, but they're definitely going to be moving things in the right direction. But I still think things are going to get significantly worse before then, right? You have, I think Europe's going to go through a sovereign debt default. They're like trying to like usher in, World War III over there. It's kind of crazy. World trade is collapsing, right? And then you also just have like, I don't know, I assume cities are going to deteriorate. Things are like, regardless of who wins the next presidential election, the other side is not going to be too happy about it.
Hmm.
And so the question becomes, okay, what do you do? Right? As an individual person, like where do you go? How do you kind of insulate yourself? And this kind of point of being able to be self-sufficient and autonomous and kind of weather the coming storm, like, you got to be able to be competent, right? You have to realize that a lot of these systems, you know um the work I'm doing now is kind of maintaining certain infrastructure, and you just realize just how tenuous a lot of this infrastructure is,
Oh,
right?
definitely. We're always, it seems like 2 or 3 days away from it just turning off and
Yeah.
not being able to get it back on.
So, I would encourage people, is like, how self-sufficient can you be, right? Or can you be part of a group of guys who can kind of cover the areas in which you can't be self-sufficient? Like you have that neighbor who can be, right? I think, this is kind of a theme that I've been running with recently, is just in kind of encouraging people. Like, I think the era of the timeline is coming to a close. Like the algorithm and everything is just too noisy. You have too many people coming into the space. I think you have a lot of people who see Trump winning as an inevitable thing now, and human biodiversity and destruction of Western civilization talking points are getting more popular, and we're just getting tons of people in our space. You have like Destiny, the omni liberal, like talking about these things. You're just like, dude, like what is happening? What is this timeline? But
No, because we've kind of touched on like, and we're way off the book right now, but
yeah.
I'm really interested in that. There's a lot of rumor going around about who is paying whom, right? About
Mm,
who is the puppet of whom, right? And that
mm.
guy, he screams just bought and paid for,
Oh
you
yeah.
know. So it's like, who is writing his script right now, and who's telling, like, who's moving the puppet right now, and like
Yeah.
why. And again, I do have a conspiratard brain, so that's where I always go,
Yeah.
just because I had access to YouTube at an early age when it was, you could still find out. Oh geez, I remember, like, I got really into Nostradamus's predictions, and
Mm.
how the end of the world was going to be ushered in by Obama. And anyway, that's neither here nor there. But yeah, because in one of the group chats that you and I are a part of, you
Mm.
were kind of talking about this as well, where it seems like there are a lot of players right now who are trying to take each other's pieces off the board, and whether they're actual, like, hard targets, or online personalities, there seems to be a lot of that going on.
Yeah. Well, so a few things. One, I've gotten really into the Y files recently on YouTube. I find that that's like if you're
To
into
look
the
into.
yeah, if you're into the conspiratainment stuff, that'll definitely scratch your itch, and they're pretty funny. But the to kind of about the the conspiracy things around like Destiny and all those guys, the way I see it is kind of like with the vaccine, right? It's like at the very basic normie level, you can have a conversation with people about the vaccine, and you can just say, "Hey, look, like they were motivated by money. They rushed this thing out. They cut corners. They didn't really know what they were doing. It's brand new. There was a lot of fear and concern, and so maybe they didn't make the best choices, right? Like it's a very reasonable stance that like even if people are hesitant, like they can kind of like they can see that as long as you pitch it in a way that
I don't want to be reasonable. I want to be angry.
yeah. But then you have your like tinfoil hat wearing guys who are literally saying like, oh, they're putting like 5G nanobots in your body and all of this kind of stuff.
You're putting an
And
ancient Sumerian language in your body, and it's going to turn you into a slave.
exactly. And so like this is the thing is it's probably somewhere in the middle, right? And I think similarly with these guys, like at the very least you can see that it's just like this is what's popular, and so I'm going to be audience captured, right? I'm going to try to drive towards that. I have a like a article on my Substack about this, and it's to me I think what's important is that people realize that the shift is occurring, right? That this is becoming popular, that Trump's probably going to win, that like, and a lot of people just want to be on board with the winning side. It's not because they believe in the principles of the winning side or anything like that, right? And so how do you differentiate between, who's actually, trying to push you to your best interest? Because we talked a little bit about this at the beginning. It's like it's very easy to get stuck like just consuming rage bait content or kind of self-improvement porn, right? Where it's just there's no actual action or movement. And that's why, and what kind of got us on this was like, all right, what do you do next? And I do think it's get in the group chats, meet people, build stuff, realize that things aren't going to get easier, and so the way that you deal with that is you get stronger. And to kind of tie it back to Snow Crash, right, it's the same thing where it's like Hero at the start of his story, he has this huge potential. He's this great swords fighter. He's a hacker, but he's living in the container at the storage unit with another guy, right? It's only that when he goes on this adventure that he actually starts to self actualize and be part of this and be part of a solution, even if it's just kind of a temporary one in the short term. And I've had a few conversations with people recently. It's like, what are we trying to do online? What are we really getting at? And to me, I think there's a lot of guys out there who are kind of these untapped hero protagonists, right? These guys who are smart, they're driven, they want to do the right thing, they're motivated, but they just don't know what to do, right? Or how to apply themselves, right? They're pretty happy just, being in the, the storage container and like being in the metaverse, right? It's not that
They
it
want
isn't
to eat their
entertaining.
bugs. They want to
Yeah.
fit in the pod.
Well, I don't think that they want that, right? But they don't necessarily know what the alternative is.
Mm.
And I think that's the important thing is like that's what good books and good literature are about. That's what, you know, what I think the space should be about is cool. You figured out that there's problems and there's concerns and the world is holding you back in all of these different ways. What can you really do about it? Like, how do you transcend that? And, and it is going out and taking risks and, dealing with the craziness of the world around us. But I can tell you from personal experience, I mean, life is, not to sound too corny, but life is the greatest adventure, right? And you don't want to be missing out on that. And I think we're definitely coming up on some hard times, but if you are proactive about meeting that challenge, I think they're also going to be very interesting times as well.
I think I'll let you have the last word there. That was terrific. Definitely, I co-sign on everything you just said, and I hope that everybody's out there building ties that bind. Sir, where can people find your work? Where can they support you? How can they kind of get involved with the projects that you got going on?
Yeah, so I'm mostly active on Twitter. So if you are interested and kind of liked what we had to talk about today, check me out there. I have links. I have a website which also has links out to my Substack, all that kind of stuff. I mean, if you want to support me, I always appreciate a subscription on the Substack. That's really kind of the only way that the only thing I have kind of like up that people can do. But yeah, I mean, and then the other big thing that I always say is, a lot of my content is focused on, helping people kind of find a path from the mainstream delusion towards the parallel movement, kind of getting involved, self-actualizing, all that kind of stuff. And so, if you are kind of on that path yourself, if you're just looking for someone to talk to, or if you kind of, have a certain problem you're grappling with, like I always encourage people like reach out in the DMs, right? You'd be surprised how few people actually will DM you and take you up on that. But when you do, like I've met some really interesting people and done some really interesting stuff. So yeah, don't be shy, reach out. But if you just also like passively consuming content, I'm not super great or consistent about always putting things out on the podcast and stuff, but I have a few good ones coming out soon. And yeah, definitely check them out there.
And I'll make sure to put links to everything that you got going on in the show notes. As for me, dear listener, thank you for if you've reached this part of the podcast. Thank you very much. If you want to support Canon Fodder and the Double Dealer, you can do so by buying a magazine. Issue 13 is now out. You can become a paid subscriber on our Substack. You can like, you can share, you can subscribe, all that good stuff. Again, terrible at ending podcasts, so I'll just say insert ending here.